So this is part 3 of our sessions we've been doing on bringing up a brand new UC system from scratch with UC 560. Of course, we always want to remind you the background and the experience we're bringing in through here, but we've already discussed that in these sessions, so I'm not going to go through that in detail today. And again, we're really talking at this point through these sessions about our solution delivery part of our pipeline. In other sessions, we may be talking more about solution design and solution support, but today, and the focus of the last couple sessions have been on that solution delivery. As a reminder, you're in the right place if you're a partner that deploys on-premises TOUC systems or supports on-premises TOUC systems, or if you just want a full feature review of the TOUC, even if you're not going to be deploying things on site, sometimes seeing how, or on premises, sometimes seeing how those systems are deployed can help inform even how we approach a hosted or cloud opportunity. So we've been going through that example configuration. We've been reviewing the new interfaces and screens as we go and talked about best practices, especially around labeling and documentation and use of tools like provisioning to save significant amounts of time on setup. We've gone through quite a lot in these last couple of sessions, from a full overview of the admin to getting the system on the network, getting it connected to trunks, setting up our tenants, verifying our licenses, setting up a basic dial plan, importing users, configuring templates for them, and provisioning them. Today, we're going to continue with our dial plan build out now that we have our users in here. So we'll be talking about auto attendants, hunt groups, ACD queues, and park locations as our primary points of focus, but we'll also touch on other elements throughout the dial plan module today. If time allows, we'll also go ahead and take a brief look at the user portal just to give everyone a point of reference there. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can bulk update users with provisioning, just like we talked about bulk importing and creating users with provisioning. If you need to make an update to an existing user, that is a phenomenal tool that, again, saves you time and prevents human error if you're having to enter the same information in 20 times, much less likely to have a typo or something like that if you get it right once and then use a template to build it out. Just as a reminder, we're building up a TOUC mini server that's targeted at supporting just a 25 user installation, so a relatively small deployment. It's being deployed at the customer's primary location. They have additional locations as well as remote workers. So we need to have the system configured to support internal and external users. And we're connected to the PSTN via the West Telecom SIP trunks. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive on into the admin here. Would help if I check. And bear with me just 1 second, and we'll be right in. All right, so we've spent time in the past taking a look at most of these modules with a focus on system, global, dial plan, and the users and devices. Today, at least for our first section, we're going to spend most of our time on the dial plan. With some detours into users and devices, as well as logging in as a different user with a user portal to discuss there as well. As a refresher, for the last time we built this system, we set up an access code because this customer wanted to dial a 9 to get to the outside world. We set up 3 extension blocks, their main business office, a separate warehouse, and then remote users. And we set up an example emergency number. This is something we always want to make sure we set up as an emergency number early in the process when possible, because it's one of the things that, if left till the end, is unfortunately potential oversight. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. We always want to make sure that's configured so that if a 911 call gets made, it always goes to the right place. You'll notice, though, of course, that we haven't built up any other capabilities. So, for example, all we can do right now is call station to station. For those users with DID numbers, they can receive direct calls, and then everybody can make outbound calls by dialing 9. Part of the reason we built this way was to focus really strongly on those users. One of the things we can do, though, is now that we have our users, we can build out more of the system. So we're going to start by building some ranges here. The first thing I'm going to do is build an auto attendant. And what we're going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and assign that out to a 4-digit extension range. Because of the way we handle our dial plan, overlapping like this is absolutely fine. You're not going to get any glare conditions between a 100 and a 1000. And this is a practice that I sometimes follow because it's useful to keep those as far away from each other. You have lots of room for expansion and growth. This is not necessary. We could certainly have made this a 110 to 119, for example, or even if we're just doing a single auto attendant, just a single number. But as a reminder, when I build ranges, I like to usually give myself a little bit of additional space if the customer's needs allow it. That way we can accommodate growth without having to make as many changes in the future. So that's one of the reasons I might choose to put out an auto attendant like this. If a feature is being dialed a lot, I'm much more likely to put it in the same extension length as the user's extensions are. So if there was a hunt group that was called internally or transferred internally too frequently, and it was transferred to or called manually rather than through a speed dial or a DSS BLF key, I would be much more inclined to put it in the same range because users are going to be more comfortable with consistently dialing the same length of numbers. But for something like this, where we're going to map a DID to it, and other than testing, we don't expect inbound users to call it, we'll go ahead and set here. Again, as a reminder, because we created this here, I can now go into the destinations and I have auto attendants to configure. Nothing is live at this point until I do that second step. I'm also going to create some ranges here for those other elements we talked about. So and again, I'm just leaving myself lots of room for future planning. We're only going to use one in each. So we're going to do a hunt group. We're just calling it the main group. So if someone calls in and doesn't know where else to go, we're going to send them there. And then just to give us a chance to talk about it more, we're going to also build an Acd queue, and we're going to refer to this as sales. So at this point, we've got the ability, or we're building ourselves the ability to receive an inbound call, have a caller make a selection, and then we have a couple different distribution options for how we're going to send those calls out. Other items that we may choose to add, and that depending on your customer needs, are available as well, would be a park location. So your customer is almost always going to let you know whether they use call park or not, because that's either a key part of their workflow or something that they never touch. So it's there to build as needed. So we'll go ahead and build one out just in case it is needed here. And because a call park is something that the users are slightly more likely to dial, although we generally would recommend configuring this with keys to access. We're going to go ahead and put it in that 3-digit range. Again, I'm putting it in a different number block, so it's not going to overlap. So I don't have anything that starts with a 500 right now. But that's more just a practice that I'm following, not a mandatory requirement. We could have done anything that doesn't conflict with another line. And then just to confirm as well, if I do build something that overlaps, you're not allowed to save it. So always want to make sure we get the right data in there the first time because it lets us be efficient and fast, but the system's going to catch you and prevent you from creating something that has a number conflict. You'll also notice a host server here. For an individual on-prem system like we're talking about today, this is pretty much not going to matter. Where this comes into play, though, is when we're talking about clustered systems or our cloud deployments where we have multiple points of presence. In either of those cases, for a park location, also for our audio conference bridging, we can choose which server is going to host that feature. That lets us keep things consistent, and that lets us or always route calls to the right destination. You can, on a cluster, you can choose to have all your services hosted on one system and then the other one's just your backup. Or you can build that out uh, geographically. So let's say, for example, that instead of doing a single server on-premises system like we're doing today, this was a 2-server cluster, and one was in the warehouse and one was in the business office that we've already defined. In a case like that, if the park locations were going to be used in the business office, we'd put them against that server, and if they were going to be used in the warehouse, we put them against that server, just to reduce the number of hops. Either way is going to function, and calls can get from, we'll route to and from there appropriately, but do want to make sure we call that out. So I'm going to go ahead and create this here, just so we have it available. Park locations don't have any other configuration elements outside of what we touched here. So theoretically, these are already ready to go. I could take a phone, I could call into it. In practice, though, if you're building park locations, to make them truly useful, we're going to be using keys. So we'd actually go into a user or into their device and set up appropriate keys. This is one place where using templates is going to be a strong way to do that. And then the other element that I'm not going to touch on in detail today, but I'll build out just so we have it for reference, is our conference rooms. These are, at this point, audio-only conference bridges. They're just included in the system, so it's available to use as needed. I like my round numbers. We really test these and target these for up to 20 users or so. So it's great for impromptu calls, but it's not something I would necessarily recommend if you have a client who's routinely doing large webinars or having 50, 60, 100 person calls. We have a separate conference solution available for that, though, and we're happy to work with you there. Just like park locations, I built up a conference room. It's ready to go, but unlike park locations, I do have some additional configuration I can do. Just as a reminder, we already touched inbound routing last time, where we talked about assigning DID numbers and assigned numbers that were already here to a combination of user extensions or fax destinations. So we have all of those assigned. One of the things we'll be doing in a little bit here is coming back through and taking one of these DIDs and mapping it into that primary auto attendant. Outbound routing, we've already left as is. We've got our caller ID set up the way we want. We've got our main dialing group set here, and we can add a secondary one if needed. And then we've developed and set our default route for our outbound emergency calls so that they'll always make sure we go through an expected carrier. That's going to come into play in terms of that default route, most commonly with on-prem systems where you might have a mixture of interfaces. So for example, if you're supporting both SIP lines and then you also have, say, a failover or fallback analog line in case of a network outage, we may choose, or you may choose to, for example, prefer the analog lines for emergency calls because those are going to be more resilient in certain cases. It's entirely up to the customer need and what you deem best, but we give you the options to control that. And now we're on to destinations. So we've got ranges now for auto attendants, hunt groups, ACD queues, and the conference room. On the conference rooms, I'm going to touch on this very briefly. One thing to note here is when I've created them, they auto-create with a pin that matches the conference room bridge number. Generally, that's something we're going to want to change because you don't want your conference rooms being too guessable. However, if you front-end this with an auto attendant, for example, so your callers don't know what conference room they're reaching, or if you directly tie a DID to it, that'd be, again, where they just dial the public number and they don't necessarily have a relation to the internal room. That's less of a concern, but still would generally recommend a stronger pin than a 3-digit if pins are required and used. We can also blank those out if we want something wide open, but that's not a recommended or usual use case. You'll also notice we can assign users to this. What that does is it allows us to delegate management of a particular conference room or rooms to a user so that then in their user portal they can go through and they can set all of these same settings. What pin do we want to use? Are we going to record calls? When a call comes in, our callers reach the conference bridge, are they prompted to record their name so that we can do call announcement? And that just lets you delegate it out to individual users, so it's not always an admin task to manage and change those features. But otherwise, as it is, any of these rooms are ready to go right now. You could pick up a phone, dial it, and you're in the bridge. We'll also touch briefly on our operator destination. This simply defines where 0 goes when you're in certain environments. Most notably, for example, a voicemail box, if a user's personal operator has not been defined, it will check what 0 does here. It also is a shortcut reference available in some of these other configurations we're going to look at. All right, let's go in and build us an auto attendant. This is going to be a relatively simple auto attendant. Those of you who've been through training with me before know that with things like auto attendants and ACD queues especially, we could have entire sessions just on this one feature. But we do want to touch on it because we can cover a 90% use case very rapidly. So we'll select the first one. Again, I gave us a range to give us some flexibility, and if we needed to create new menus in the future, that's there, and it's just one less step to have to think about the next time. But for today, we're only going to build a single one. I'm going to go name. We're just going to call it the main number because this is where everything's going to come into. And then we've got a few decisions to make. The first is we've taken a look at our tabs across the top. So we've got our default. You'll notice that's enabled, but everything else is disabled. Default or alternate must always be on. After hours and holidays are your choice when you set this up as an admin. If I enable alternate, it will disable default and vice versa. This allows us to temporarily put an override in place on a menu without having to modify the core configuration. So if there's a training day and you want to have a different greeting presented, for example, we could do that through the alternate and then manually turn it back off when done. For events that are scheduled, though, that was going to be your after hours or your holiday menus. We'll talk about those in a moment. When we come in, you're going to get a relatively basic screen here. So you see the configuration, you see that enable disable state. And then you have your initial properties. This controls what happens before a menu is presented. This first option here for immediate exit, we can say we don't even want to present a menu when it comes to the auto attendant. We're just going to say if we reach our default menu, let's transfer to an extension. And we can search through here. If we know the extension number we're transferring to, we can manually type it in. We could also do the same thing with a hunt group, someone's voicemail box, a different auto attendant ACD queue, or that operator we just defined. This is most commonly used in conjunction with a schedule. There's very few cases where it's going to make sense to build an auto attendant that all it does is immediately transfer to a different destination. It's generally more to just go straight to that other destination from your DID mapping, for example, in that case. But if we pair this with a schedule, so during the day we go to a person or persons for a live answer, and then after hours or holidays, we present a greeting. This is a more common use case and one that can be relatively, or you'll see much more frequently than just a straight transfer in this case. However, here we want to build a menu. You'll notice that the default exit action when we come up here is going to be hang up. That's going to mean that if someone calls into the main menu, here's whatever greetings we configure, and either doesn't make a selection or dials an invalid selection, we hit 3 times of a timeout or an error, the system's going to hang up. That prevents things like pocket dials from tying up resources for too long. And it also can...
Sorry, guys.
So that prevents pocket dials from tying up resources too long or from someone just being in the menu and being stuck in a loop. There are cases, though, where instead of hanging up, sorry about that, where instead of hanging up, what we want to do is transfer that to somewhere else. So that's, again, whether you're immediately exiting or not, we have the options to do that to anywhere internal to the system. This might be a case where you want to present options to the caller, and then if the caller doesn't make a selection, immediately go to a different destination. So if I was to build that, for example, I might say, let's build a hunt group destination. And then I might actually lower my timeout value to 1. So once we hit a timeout, we'll just immediately transfer out to this hunt group. Uh, so that's that's your standard, please stay on the line or make a selection type prompt here. Once we've got this area configured, you'll notice I didn't touch our digit timeouts or our dialing timeouts. So you got 3 seconds between dialing digits or 6 total seconds if there's some ambiguity between what you've dialed before the system's going to assume dialing is complete and moves you on. Um, pardon me. Uh, these are generally sane defaults, and that they generally provide a good caller experience. However, if needed, we do give you the option to tweak that incredibly granularly because it is set in milliseconds. I generally wouldn't take either of these below 1 to 2 seconds because when you get to that point, you'll often see, especially if someone's trying to dial an extension and trying to remember what number they're dialing, you might see calls route to the wrong place or an increase in caller frustration. So yours to configure and tweak as needed, but these are generally pretty safe defaults. And then we're going to need to build a menu. If I click Add Menu for the first time, it's going to build a main menu here. And we have actions and 2 greeting options for it. Actions are going to be the caller selections, so your 0 through 9 star or a multi-digit. We're going to go ahead and build out a couple of those right now. And again, keeping this relatively basic. So I'm going to say if I dial 0, transfer to the operator, I could just as easily say transfer to an extension or a hunt group. It just depends on how frequently I expect something like that to change. If operator is a value that I'm changing relatively frequently, I might use this operator extension as I've got it set here, allowing me to be flexible and change it in one place. If this is something that's going to be relatively set in stone, or I want to have options to manage this outside of what the operator is doing, I'll generally explicitly go to the destination I'm looking for rather than using the operator shortcut. So we'll build an option. So if someone calls in and dials 0, they're going to go to their operator. We're going to dial 1, and it's not quite ready yet because we haven't built this hunt group out, but we're going to say we're going to transfer that out to that hunt group we're going to build. I can manually type this in because I know what I'm going to put there. However, if I was to search, you're not going to see a result. So we'll still allow you to put that in because we know that depending on how you're working through setting up the system, you might not have all your resources yet, but until that hunt group is built, if someone was to select an option 1, it would terminate the call for them because it wouldn't actually have a route there. So we want to make sure we build that all the way through. And then we're option 2, we're going to have go into the ACD queues we're going to be building. So this would be for general questions, press 1, for sales, press 2, or if you need assistance, press 0 to connect to the operator. We can give a standard approach like that. Finally, we'll have a multi-digit option. And multi-digit, we can choose to either go to the dialed extension or the dialed voicemail. During the day, most of the time, we're going to see this go to dialed extension, but we do have customers who use the dialed voicemail feature, especially for their after-hours menus. So at this point, we've got a basic menu. Obviously, we can add and extend to it from here. One of the things I'm not going to cover today in the interest of time is I will not be covering secondary menus in detail. I just want to make sure I'm calling that out so that I'm not catching you off guard. We do have the option to add additional menus on here. These ones you can label, and then you can use those to build a full phone tree inside of a single auto attendant. Depending on how you're managing and what sort of changes or how many different destinations might be getting into these shared trees, sometimes it makes sense to build them as submenus. Sometimes it makes sense to build them as separate auto attendants. It really does depend on how you're going to use those resources, but we give you the tools to take either approach. And then finally, we need to upload a file. This can be an MP3 or WAV. The system will auto-convert it to an appropriate value. I'm going to go ahead and just put in an example message here. You'll notice we have a primary greeting and a repeat greeting. Primary greeting is what is played when you first reach the system. And if there's no repeat greeting set, if you hit that timeout or error state and we need to play a menu or a greeting again, we'll play the same one. If I choose to upload a repeat greeting, this is what's played in any replays. So again, if I dial a invalid destination, if I make a incorrect choice or just don't make any choice at all, the repeat greeting can be presented. This is entirely optional, but we find it can provide a better caller experience. For example, this menu or message I just loaded here is more than a minute long, with a lot of boilerplate in the front of it. What we might do in that case is build a repeat greeting that just presents the menu options again, so that someone, if they misdial or aren't sure where to dial or don't dial anything, just receives their options again so they can get through the menu. Not mandatory, but like I said, can lead to a better user experience. As soon as I hit save here, this system is ready to go. This auto attendant is all set, and I can point a DID number to it, and it will function as we just defined. As I did state, we're pointing to some destinations that haven't been built yet, so we need to make sure we build those before it actually goes into production. In some cases, it makes sense to build your hunt groups or ACD queues first and then come back and build the auto attendants. It really depends on the features and functionality you're going to be building out. So I built just a default menu here. If I wanted to override those values for an after-hour state or holidays, we do have those options too. Again, I'm going to keep this relatively high level in the interest of time, but we're always happy to go into more detail. And we will have a session next week that's more open forum, so we have some great times to discuss and go in as deep as we need to cover this for you. If I'm in the after hours menu, the first thing I need to do is choose my work days. So for example, let's say I'm doing your standard 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. You'll also notice there's a time zone selection. By default, this is going to pull whatever the system's default time is. So in a lot of cases on an on-prem deployment like this, you're not going to actually have to change this or think about it. But because we have remote users and because we do have systems deployed supporting operations across multiple time zones, we find it very helpful to be able to set an auto attendant to function in a given time zone so that when we're talking with the end users about what times they want routed, we can always be talking their local time. It can save on confusion. So I built a schedule, but you'll notice that I still haven't enabled this menu. Right now, if I click save, the schedule will persist, but it's not going to keep that menu going through. I need to come through and just like we talked about on the default and alternate menus, I need to click that enable flag to tell it that we will be using this state. And then I can choose to configure another menu. This can have an entirely different set of options, although in most cases, for practical purposes, you'll probably have very similar options with a different greeting played. Holidays are the same way. We've got a large number of pre-canned ones in here. We also allow you to define your own custom holiday states. Once you set those as needed, we do the same thing. You would enable that holiday feature, build out the menus with whatever greetings you need there. For now, though, we're just going to keep this at the default just to keep things moving forward. If I wanted to, I can also come in and I'm going to pick this first number here, and I'm going to say, I don't actually want that associated with the user. I want that associated with an auto attendant, and I will select and assign it here. And then I'm going to put a note on it so I know what this DID is and why I'm using it for this particular purpose. One thing you will note that's different about these DID numbers than what I'm doing in a lot of the rest of the screens is that when I'm assigning a DID, I have to be able to search and find a destination. I'm not able to just type in a number here. I have to explicitly find a destination. And that has to do with how we route calls behind the scenes. It also means that you're much less likely to have a misroute on a DID because we force a lookup there. So I did want to make that clear as well. So at this point, if I was to call this 315-755-1002 number, I'm going to get hit with that auto attendant, and we're ready to go from that regard. Next up, we're going to build a hunt group. We're going to build an ACD queue, and then we'll tie those all together. Hunt groups are great if what you need is some basic ring all functionality. And we can support either a sequential or a simultaneous, with simultaneous being our most common deployment method. Our delay in seconds is going to control how long we ring at a configured destination before hitting an exit. For a simultaneous, this is going to be how long we ring the total group before going to whatever exit we configure. For a sequential, this is how long we ring each member in the group before trying the next user and on the last user before going to that exit destination. You also have a pre-pin name. This is very useful so that we can modify an inbound caller ID that's displayed to an end user so that they can look at their device, and as long as it's a device that supports caller ID, regardless of whether it's a first-party device, a third-party device, or even certain analog devices through an ATA, as long as caller ID is configured there, they can see, oh, I'm getting this call because it's from the main hunt group. Generally, when I do configure hunt groups or ACD queues, this is a feature I use very frequently. The one consideration is you're still working with a relatively small display, so I've called this business office main. This is probably longer than I would want for if I was going to be printing the names. I might bring it down to something like a main hunt group. That way more of the original caller ID is visible. Next, we're going to go ahead and choose our members. This is going to be our main in our business office, and I'm going to choose, we want 5 users here to come through. You'll note if a user's already in the list, they do not show back up. We do have our universal search here as well. This particular screen is a single select, but you will see in future updates a change to support the multi-select using Shift or Control on a desktop environment, same as what we do in our provisioning for large assignments at once. Because we're doing a simultaneous one, the order I've added them here doesn't matter, but if I did need to concern myself about order, it's just a drag and drop to reorder them. And then finally, we choose our exit destination, which is where do we go if no one else can answer. It can be anywhere that the system can reach. So this can be internal destinations. It can be an external number. A lot of the time we'll see this go to another auto attendant, a secondary hunt group, or someone's voicemail box. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and put it into voicemail for extension 100. As soon as that's saved, within 10 seconds of that save state occurring, we're ready to call it. So I could call into the auto attendant. I could choose option 1. We'll attempt to ring these phones, and then after 18 seconds, we're going to go right into that user's voicemail. Hunt groups are great because they're fast to set up, they're easy to use, and they're predictable. But they're also rather rigid. It's always going to do the same thing. We configure it. There's not a lot of logic that adapts to different states, and that's where things like an ACD queue come into play. So with an ACD queue, philosophically, the goal of an ACD queue is the same as a hunt group. I have a number, and when that number is dialed, I want to reach a group of users so that someone can answer the call. The difference is in all the details of how this works. Hunt groups, like I said, are always going to ring every destination, whereas an ACD queue has a few differences. First is its log in, log out. So if you're a member of a hunt group, you're going to get a hunt group call unless you do not disturb your phone. If you are a member of an ACD queue, you're only going to get an ACD call if you are logged into your queues and you are not already on a queue call. So we can be a little more intelligent with how those calls route through. I'm going to go ahead and just set things up as I'm talking here. Again, just like what we're doing with other values, I'm going to build some destinations. In this case, if no one answers, we're going to drop into the voicemail box for the user at extension 109. This part's going to be identical to what we just did with the hunt groups, but it's when we get to this strategy that things start to change. Ring all is going to be equivalent to what you see, a very close equivalent to what you see with a sequential in our hunt groups. And this is great, especially for a small system where people aren't used to using the ACDs as much. However, it does have some limitations on the number of calls that can be processed at the same time. With a ring all group, any available agents when a call comes in are going to receive that call, and they'll all ring with that call until someone answers it or it times out. This can be really useful, um, but it does mean that it can only present a single call at a time. So if I have 3 calls in queue, it's only going to ring all the available agents with call 1. Once that is answered, it's going to ring with call 2. And once that one's answered, it's going to ring with call 3. The other modes we have, rather than ringing everyone in the group, give us different options for how we can select what agent or agents are going to be presented with the call so that multiple calls can be presented at once. For example, if we're doing a round robin mode, we're going to sequentially work our way through the list of agents. And let's say I have 3 available agents in that same scenario. 3 calls come into the queue. Agent 1 is going to get call 1. Agent 2 will be presented with call 2. Agent 3 will be presented with call 3. And then when those calls clear up, let's say there's just those 3 agents in the queue. When a 4th call comes in, if agent 1 is off their call, they'll get it and it'll work its way through that round robin list. That gives a relatively even distribution of how calls are exposed. Top down and first available give us a couple different flavors on how we work through a prioritized list, with some differences, especially when we get into our tier levels that we can talk about in more detail. Our help files also have more in-depth descriptions of all of these. And then we can do it based on agent states. So send it to the agent who's had the fewest calls since they logged in, who's had the least amount of talk time since they last logged in, or who has been the longest idle since either a login event or a call event. We do also offer a pseudo-random distribution. Uh, Generally, we use this in tests a lot, but we wouldn't necessarily see this in production because even though it is random, true randomness often doesn't feel random to users, and they're going to see patterns that aren't there, and you'll get complaints of, well, why does this person always get less calls than me? Why do I have to get all the calls? So by using one of these other modes, we can be more predictable. It's easier to understand, easier to work with. So that's one of the differences is you have a huge number of distribution strategies to really tailor how you send those calls. And we can be much more efficient in some of those strategies with handling multiple inbound calls at the same time rather than having to handle them one at a time. We can do things such as tweak priority time to configure, you know, who do I ring first if I have caller A and caller B. Caller A's reached the ACD queue first, but caller B has been in the system longer. Maybe they talked to someone else who got transferred here, or maybe they took longer in the menu selection. We can choose which of those 2 callers to prioritize when an agent becomes available. We default to queue time because it's more predictable, because you have all the visibility of time in queue. But total time makes sense in a lot of distribution strategies. That's why we give you both. I'm not going to go into many details on tiers today, but we're able to define a multiple levels of tiers. That way you can have your primary, secondary, very fine-grained control with who's preferred for inbound calls. And this lets you get to a close approximation of something like a skills-based routing without going all that way to having to define skills and do everything for it. So you can have, say, 2 or 3 groups of users. Your tier 1 are going to be presented with calls first. If no tier 1's available after a certain delay, by default, that's 18 seconds, which is your 3 ring cycles. That's why you'll see 18 and 24 seconds a lot in our system because it's based on those number of rings. If no one in tier 1's available after that delay, we'll try tier 2. If no one's available in tier 1 or 2 after that delay occurs again, or we can even make that go higher. So after we wait 18 seconds at tier 1, 36 seconds at tier 2, if we have that multiplier turned on, we'll try tier 3. So it lets you have those overflow members without having to go to a different destination and without having to be as granular with your control in terms of your day-to-day operations. You can set it up, build it that way, and that keeps things cleaner. We do offer an ability to resume a place in queue as well. This is something we don't see used nearly as frequently as it used to be. Generally, your use case here is if you get a lot of callers calling in from, say, cell phones with spotty coverage areas. This is a feature that was originally built for that purpose. So if that's enabled, you can choose a timeout. Generally, it's something like 30 to 60 seconds. And if a caller disconnects before answering and then calls back in and reaches the queue again, as long as those caller IDs match, we will credit them for the entire length of time and bump them up in your distribution order. Again, this isn't something we see as commonly used now because cell phones are a lot more reliable than they used to be, but that is what that's there for. And then we have our waiting. We have two options for it, which is our max wait time, which is your standard. How long do I wait before going somewhere else? By default, when I build a new one, it's 0, which means indefinite. With this configuration, it's going to stay on a ACD consistently and permanently until it's answered. And sometimes this is what you need, but a lot of the times that's not what we're looking for. So we can define that in seconds. Generally, I keep these a little longer than I do on a hunt group, so I might not go down to, say, an 18-second on an ACD queue like I would on a hunt group. I might do that closer to 30 to 60 seconds as my minimums when I build those out. One other difference from a caller experience is that with a hunt group, you hear ringing when you dial in. With an ACD queue, you're going to hear hold music when you dial in. So for the purposes of today, I'm going to go ahead and say our max wait time is 60 seconds, but we can make that, configure it down to the second. And then you have your max wait time, no agent. By default, we have this set to 5 minutes, which is your 300 seconds there. Again, we can make that granular as needed. This triggers when no agents are logged into the ACD queue. So if everybody's logged out for the day and a call still somehow reaches the ACD queue, we can trigger this more quickly. The reason we have a timer value in here rather than immediately going to your next destination is that way if you've got people calling in as your agents are logging in for the day or logging in after lunch, for example, you get a little bit of time to capture those calls rather than immediately going to voicemail or wherever else you have your exit destination set. So obviously there's a lot more we can do with ACDs, and this is only really scratching the surface with some of the call scenarios we can support with it. Once we've got our settings built the way we want, we need to add our agents. Adding the agents is going to be the same as we saw on a hunt group. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a few agents here. Just as we saw before, if I've already selected someone in the list, they're not available again, so you don't have to worry about accidentally putting duplicates in there. And then we also have the ability to set supervisors. A supervisor can come into the system, and when they log into their user portal, they can also see a state of the ACD queue or queues that they're a supervisor of. Again, this is just scratching the surface, but this gives us a lot of power and a lot of control for how we route calls, how we handle them through there. And everything we've talked about today is just included feature sets. So nothing we're touching on here is a license. So we can take full advantage of these capabilities to fit whatever your customer need is, as opposed to having to figure out which one's the most cost effective, because the tools are there for you to use to support your customer needs. What we're going to do very quickly now is we're going to go ahead and provision out a user with a couple settings. Like I said, what we want to do when we're making large changes or changes to more than one user, I almost always will do this with a template because, again, if you're having to do a bunch of users, you're going fast, there's a potential that you might hit typos or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to build a new template for ACD agents. And we'll just label it. This is going to set common values for members of the sales ACD. In this case, the most important thing I want to do here are my ACD agent settings. So I'm going to click all of those. Max unanswered calls is how many calls they can receive in a row before they're set to on break. The default is 3. They can go as high as 99. So if you want to make it so that they don't log out or go on break automatically, you just make that a high value, and it's generally not going to hit. Ring timeout is how long we present a call to them before we consider it unanswered. Again, just like with a lot of our systems, 3 ring cycles is our default, but we can set that to any given number of ring cycles. So I'm going to go ahead and bump that up here. Wrap-up time is how long after they've finished a call through the queue before they're considered available for another call. 10 seconds is our default. A lot of the time it's just enough to, hey, you had a call. By the time you're done with your call, you're done with everything. So we're going to give you a couple seconds to collect your thoughts, and then you're on to the next call. For more complex systems, though, I've seen this high as 1 minute, even to 5 minutes for some very complex support cases. And then we have a do not disturb delay, unavailable delay, and no answer delay. These all control what happens if various states where a call cannot be presented to the agent, even if it should otherwise be. Do not disturb is going to be if the call into the agent is receives a busy when attempting to do this. This can be most commonly either by a user putting their phone on to do not disturb or pressing the do not disturb key when they receive a call. So that way we can say, don't even try them for another 10 seconds if they've said that they're busy. And again, just like everything else, we can make that very granular. An unavailable delay is going to be if we don't see any available lines to send them a call. We'll wait longer before we send them another one. We have this configured separately from the do not disturb because that's going to be a little bit of a different case. This might be someone loaded a configuration that makes their phone need to restart, or they're using a soft phone and they restarted their computer, so they're temporarily not going to receive a call until it's back up. So we tell the system, consider them offline for a little bit longer and try other people in your queue first. And then our no answer delay is how long we wait if they ring through, they hit that ring timeout, and they just don't answer the call. Other cases I might commonly do when I'm taking a look at an ACD agent is going to be recordings. In this case, I'm going to say we're going to do an on-demand recording type so that any of these agents can dial *2, or we can provision a feature key on their phones so that if they need to keep a recording of a call, they just trigger that one star code and they'll receive a call when it's completed. And so this is going to set some common shared values for what we want in our ACD agents. Now we can come over to provisioning before we touched on new users. In this case, we're going to go over to existing users. We're going to select out an ACD agent. And I'm going to select my 100 through 10 or 105 through 109, as those are the users I've set before. We'll provision them out, and they all have those settings. If I come into those users now, they all have the longer ring timeout. They all have more max unanswered calls. And if I go to take a look at storage, their storage allocation's been increased for recordings and on-demand's been set. So not only does it save you time, but again, and I'm going to continue to stress this because it's so beneficial, it gives you the chance to make sure everything's set right the first time, and then you know that everyone's going to be equal and equivalent rather than having to come back through this. I'm going to end today's session before we give a little bit of time for Q&A with a brief look at our user portal, just to give visibility for those of you who may not have worked with the system as much in the past. So let me get that loaded now. All right, so I've logged into, this is a different system, just I wanted to have something populated here. But I've logged into a user portal for a user. This particular user is also set up as an admin, so they can go in and make changes to their own individual tenant, but I can't touch, because they're a sub-admin, they can't touch any of the common shared settings. They can't take things off the network or configure trunks or anything like this. So this is a common level of admin access we see presented to your end users. If you're supporting them and doing most of their configuration and you want to give them access to do some self-service, but don't necessarily want them to have the ability to take the system offline by deciding to turn on DHCP or make other changes without consulting with you. User portal gives a lot of functionality. What I'm going to focus on today is just quick definitions for everyone so you're aware of what we do. Your activity screen is your unified call activity. Anything that comes in or out of your extension you'll see on here. This is a test number, so you'll see a lot of calls over and over again to the same destination. I can search by caller ID, name, or number, or dialed name or dialed number. I can check and see if there's voicemails left for me, If there's a call recording, I can filter on that. I can call in, I can even listen to it or download it here. And then I can also check faxes. In this case, this user sent a large number of outbound faxes. If I want to come in, I can confirm how many pages are transmitted, see the duration, and even download a copy of what was sent as long as it's still in my storage quota and hasn't been cycled out. Speaking of faxes, as long as a user has a fax ID assigned to them or has the listed fax number set on their profile, they get access to the fax functionality. For outbound faxes, you just need to know your number, same as you would dial from your desk phone. So in our example where they require a 9, you would require a 9 here. If you're set up with a no digit required for outbound access, you just dial the number directly. We can build a list of contacts through here. So if there's common people that are faxed on a regular basis, that's all available for quick selections. Once you've put in your number or selected your contact, you'll come in, you'll choose an attachment. We can override paper size. I was almost always just going to stick as letter, but that capability is there to support certain edge cases, especially for places like doing legal work or escrow work, for example. Once that's all set, you hit send, queues it up for transmission, sends it out. Continuing to work through this list, we allow users to view their profile, but other than the password itself, we limit their ability to modify anything here. We want them to be able to see how they're configured so that if they've got questions, if there's anything they need to track or anything they need to look up, it's all here, but it's not something that they're needing to manage themselves. And we do that intentionally just to give you the control. The one thing they can change is their password. However, unlike a admin side of thing where we trust you to use strong passwords and whatever you set will be allowed through, on the user side, we do have a checker following the latest NIST standards. So we have a minimum of 8 characters. We make sure that those values match. And then we also run an integrity check where we'll reach out to a known compromised password list. And without exposing the password itself, we check to make sure that that password is not known and in common use by people trying to brute force systems. Once we pass all those cases, we let you continue through. As a note, because we are following the new NIST standards, we no longer have a requirement for special characters, lowercase, uppercase, any of that, because it's actually been found that that can be counterproductive. A new feature, this is about to be released in 5.6.1 that we'll be talking more about next week if you'd like to see that, is a detailed directory view where you can see real-time status of your users. So I'll leave that as a little sneak peek for you here, but like I said, we'll bring up more details on how that works next week as we get ready for final release. Users can control their own schedules, so they can control their work days, holidays, just like you can with an auto attendant or just like you can on the admin side. As a note, users can also set vacation days as opposed to a holiday. The difference is a holiday is a single date, a vacation day can be a range. And then we can build routing rules just like you can on the admin side. We can allow your users to come in and build their routes for custom options on the routing destinations. We can configure voicemail greetings here. We can choose what's played. In this case, if I want my recorded name to be played when someone reaches in, we can have that pop through, and that'll change my greeting. That way you can have things pre-staged, a little easier to work with. Optionally, we can allow users to come in and modify their notifications. So most commonly, for example, you might say, I'm getting everything through email. I don't want to leave a copy on the server anymore. So I'll just manage everything through my email, and we'll come through and set it up that way. Most of the time, this is something that you're going to set globally for your users, but we do allow the ability to tweak that as needed. Again, if a user has a conference room assigned to them, they're able to come in and manage it themselves. And then they can get a look at their storage allocation. They can't change their allocations, but they can at least see what they're using. Finally, they do have the option on here to come through, change their present states, view their current present state, set custom notes, and that's going to become a lot more useful as we tie that into the directory as well. Last thing I'll leave you with, just to give you a view of what we're talking about on the ACD side. If you are an ACD supervisor, you could also get access to this screen where you can see, if you click into it, you can see a list of agents, you can see any callers into a queue. And so you can see states, you can see activity, and this will resize down to mobile or all the way up to a wallboard view. All right. I want to thank everyone for joining today. That's everything we intended to cover in today's session. Again, next week we're going to be really looking to make this more of a conversation rather than just a presentation. So we're just going to structure this as an open roundtable. So if you have questions or examples you'd like to discuss, please bring those next week and we'll dive in whatever depth is necessary to cover them. That being said, if you don't have anything you want to raise, please do come anyway, because we will be using this to also go through new features such as the directory screen we briefly teased, as well as to continue to dive into capabilities. So even if you don't have a question, we'll still make sure it's worth your time. And then finally, I know we're at our mark for today, so I don't want to hold anybody up. But if you do have questions related to what we talked about today, I am available to discuss as well. Again, thank you very much for joining. We're just getting started with everything we can do with the UC, and we're excited to have you on this journey with us.